There we go. There's the red box I was looking for. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the February version of the Education Committee meeting. I'm going to call the meeting to order with great respect and humility and acknowledge that we honor the lands of the Snuneymuxw people. The Snuneymuxw people maintain their profound and unique spiritual connection to the land through ageless traditions, teachings, stewardship, and expressions of reciprocity. And our district also encompasses the lands of the Tsawwassen and Stoneymuxw people. And we're also honored to welcome the Métis and Inuit students to our district. And also to start this meeting by recognizing that we are celebrating Black History Month in the school district. We are honored to celebrate and honor the traditions and the contributions of Black British Columbians. And I just learned now that Emma Stark was a teacher at the North Cedar School and the first Black teacher on Vancouver Island. And I also will say Kong He Fat Choi, Happy Lunar New Year to everyone. It is the year of the tiger. Attributes of the tiger are strength and bravery and courage, which seem appropriate for people who are in public leadership positions right now. So I look forward to chairing this meeting. It's my first time chairing a meeting virtually, so please bear with me if we have some technical difficulties. So I'm going to start with us asking if there are any additions to the agenda. Okay, seeing none. Is there any deletions from the agenda? Okay, seeing none. Any changes of order? Okay, seeing none. Could I get somebody to move approval of the agenda? Moved by Trustee Stanley. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Trustee O'Neill. Is there any objection to approving the minute or the agenda? Okay, seeing none, it's approved unanimously. Could I get a mover for the approval of the minutes? Moved by Trustee Stanley, seconded by Trustee Robinson. Any questions about the minutes? Okay, if there's anyone who is objecting, and Karen, if you could note that I'm going to abstain since I was not present for the meeting. And Chantel is also abstaining. All right, minutes are approved. That moves us right into, we have no presentations tonight, so we're going to move right into presentations from our senior staff. And we're starting with Assistant Superintendent Tate and Director of Instruction Poulin on focus schools and assessment and data collection in Nanaimo Ladies Public Schools. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Trustee Higginson. It's lovely to see all of you this evening. As Trustee Higginson mentioned, I am here today with Director of Instruction, Jackie Poulin, and we're going to share information around two topics today. The topics of focus schools and our Nlps reading assessment weave together so beautifully. We thought we would share together in one presentation. In addition to Jackie and myself, thanks Jackie, we have a handful of our focus schools principals with us tonight. A couple of them will speak a little bit later, but I just want to acknowledge that Cindy Hack and Tricia Armour are here from Fairview, Mark Dano is here from Brecken, and Stephanie Stevens is here from Bayview. My apologies if anyone else pops on that I've missed, but that's those are the principals that are with us now, so it's wonderful to have them with us here this evening. Okay, I'm going to get, pardon me, I'm going to jump right in and get started. Thanks, Becky, for the next slide. So, gosh, focus schools started about 7 years ago. It seems like it just started, and in other ways, it seems like we've been together for quite a long time. So I remember we had an initiative running called E2 Now, it was something started by the ministry, but we took the initiative in Nlps and sort of made it ours, and we called it E2 You can see our logo. Bob Brooks, the VP of Bayview, created that logo for us, and you can see the butterfly is in the shape of an E2 And this was a reading initiative from early years to grade 3, where we pulled every single teacher and Strong Start facilitator in from early years, Strong Start kindergarten to grade 3, over a period of a year to look at the teaching of reading. And we learned a whole lot during this time. but there is one particular piece of data, a little story that I remember distinctly, and that this piece of data was really an impetus for why we started the focus schools. And it was, we were able to look at the time, I was district principal of Indigenous education, and we looked at the beginning of grade 4 reading results for Indigenous students in our district here. And we also looked at the completion rates that year, that same year, for our Indigenous students. And there was less than 1% difference between the reading rates of students at the end of grade 3, beginning of grade 4, and the completion rates. Now, there could be all sorts of variables involved there, but it really was an impactful piece of information. And it was through that we started talking in learning services about what we could do to increase those rates, increase both the reading rates and the completion rates in some of our more vulnerable schools. So at the time, Bob Eslinger and I, we looked at a variety of data. You can see on the screen here, report card marks. We looked at the EDI, the Early Developmental Instrument, Vulnerability Index. We paid special attention to schools that had high Indigenous populations, particularly those schools that received on-reserve populations. And we essentially crunched the numbers, and we lined up all the data, lined up all the schools. And Bayview, Fairview, Brecken, and Georgia were not only the 4 schools that had the most extraordinary challenges and complexities, they sat far beyond the rest of the district, the rest of the other 20-odd schools. And so we sort of jumped in with both feet. We had some ideas about reading. We pulled together the principals from those 4 schools, and that's where we started. We started talking. Didn't exactly know what we were doing, and eventually sort of worked it out. And over the years, the focus schools have grown a little bit, and then they've right-sized again back down. You can see the list of schools there over a period of 7 years to where we are now, which is Focus School 3.0, where we have the 6 schools. And next slide. And so once we started working together and learning a lot about reading, learning a lot about our students, learning a lot about our families, we eventually developed a vision and goals for the Focus Schools Initiative. And they're there for you on the screen. Overarchingly, we narrowed the focus. We really tightly narrowed the focus, which I will say was a huge impact to the success of Focus Schools. And I still continue to believe that notion. And we looked at reading. So we looked at increasing the reading success for all students, but paying very special attention to our Indigenous readers and their success. RTI was very new at that time to us in NLPS. So during this process, we learned a lot. We established solid knowledge understandings around RTI, around a tiered process. We also wanted to make sure that we gleaned what we could and learned what we could from Focus Schools in order to inform us as leaders in the system, as teachers in the system, and share it out with other schools. And so we wanted to make sure we expanded our repertoire of evidence-based practices around the teaching of reading. Now this year, we've expanded reading to also include inclusion. So what we learned over the 7 years is we've learned a lot about the mechanics of actually teaching reading. Pardon me. What we also noticed is that when we practice universal design for learning, when we practice differentiated instruction, and when we think about all the diverse learners in our classroom and pre-plan and plan, and then teach and assess in that cycle, we are able to capture far more of our learners. And so we've expanded the Focus Schools goals and vision to include also inclusive practices, which of course just blend seamlessly with our teaching practices. So next slide. So some of the things that we noticed that are very supportive to our Focus Schools, and Focus Schools have told us that are very supportive. First off is the network. We've been very close for 7 years. We've changed iterations, we've had different iterations and changed size of our network, but we rely on one another and we come together often. And we support and learn from one another, and that's been very, very beneficial. There has been increased, as well as the support, increased principal, vice principal time at the schools and at the four original 1.0 schools. And in smaller schools like Bayview and Bracken, this means that they get to have a vice principal, which is very impactful. And it's one of the hardest jobs in the system, the elementary vice principal. But what a difference it makes when a principal has a partner and a teammate in the work that they can do together. The focus schools also receive support through a literacy coordinator. Historically, that support has been in the version of a 0.5 reading teacher. This year, in shrinking the number of focus schools, we were able to allow reading teachers in 4 of the 6 schools, a 1.0 reading teacher, which has made a huge difference. And so when we've expanded the focus schools a little bit to include inclusive practices, and we've branched from K to 3, which is where we've always focused, to open up a little bit more to K to 7 now, there's the reading teacher that has a twice the amount of time that they used to. Class size considerations are always taken into account when we look at focus schools. With our LOU 17, it's reduced class sizes overall anyway. In our focus schools, those class sizes are often reduced even further. Focus schools also have received over the years a number of resources, usually to purchase books, books for kids. In most part, we've done all sorts of initiatives where we've purchased all sorts of books with Indigenous content, where Indigenous children can see themselves reflected in these books. We've purchased Tier 3 reading resources for professional resources for teachers and leaders. So resources are also another benefit. Focus schools each have a full-time child family support worker. For the focus schools who have come in for a little while and have then graduated out, have also been given grant monies where they have pursued literacy or reading inquiries in their school, and they're awarded a sum of money to pursue that inquiry. And lastly, I'll say that the principals and vice principals in the focus schools have received as well all sorts of professional development and leadership development support over the years during our regular meetings throughout the year. And I will say that the qualitative data or street or map data has become and is central to the focus schools. It is so central to the focus schools. I am reminded of a story that I heard a couple of years ago about a child, a new kindergarten student, who took a long time for that child to agree and to feel comfortable enough to enter the school. And then it took another period of time for that child to be willing to enter their classroom or the library. And then over the course of this kindergarten year, by the end of this kindergarten year, this child was sitting in the lap of or next to their teacher being read to. And I share that story because, well, it's a beautiful story just on its own right there. But this child's reading data, quantitative data, probably would show that they're still well below grade level. They hadn't reached any of the benchmarks that were averaged for a kindergarten student in British Columbia. But just in that small snippet of a story, we saw the tremendous growth that this child experienced that wouldn't be recognized in quantitative data. So I share that story because the focus schools value and are born of qualitative data, particularly the street and map data. And so I think about some of the impacts, the positive impacts that we see from the focus schools that are a little bit more intangible, if you will. And that's one of them, this growth where students make tremendous leaps and bounds in their reading levels, but it might not be, when we look at summative or map or satellite data, it might not be shown in that way. The school culture in focus schools is something to be marked. We have a couple of principals that will speak a little bit later, and you'll get some more information from them and probably a little bit of an insight into some of the school culture, but the focus schools work. Door open policy is way more common. Collaboration is really common. The unified focus, being in a focus school is voluntary. So it's an invitation, and it's an invitation because we want the leadership and the staff to want to be there, to want to learn, to want to work together toward this unified goal, if you will. And having that unified focus moves and shifts schools and their practice and reading results greatly because of so many reasons, right? That they're all focused, they're sharing resources, they're talking the same language, they're utilizing PLC time very much so to analyze their data. So that's another piece that we miss in not having PLC time in the focus schools. And so I want to mention sort of some of the intangibles and the qualitative data that is so impactful in focus schools. And all this, I also want to say that all of this is within this context of the current COVID-19, which makes everything quite a bit more difficult. So I wanted to make sure that we don't forget that. I know that's hard to forget that, but just to mention that, just so that we're mindful of that. So I'm going to jump now to a little bit of quantitative data because I know this interests lots of people. And as I mentioned, although quantitative data, street or map data, is what steers the focus school ship, if you will, we also utilize, of course, some quantitative data. And today it's in the form of report cards. So report cards changed significantly around about 2016 when there was an option from the Ministry of Education to participate in a reporting pilot. And here at NLPS, we jumped in with both feet and made whole system change, particularly K-9. So when focus schools started in 2014, report cards at that time weren't as conducive, our report cards weren't as conducive to providing some sort of useful data, not as useful as they are now. So in year one, where we were just getting started developing our goals and our vision, the kinds of data that schools collected was quite unique to each school, and they were very much street data kinds of collection. Year two, we switched a little bit to not only including that street level or classroom level data, but we also included some running records. So for each student, so that we could have some sort of summative data that I could be reporting out annually to the board. That was very labor intensive. And by year 3 or 4 and up to the present, we have changed our elementary report card system to reflect the new reporting order or some of the pieces of the reporting pilot. So report card data, as you know, includes all areas of the curriculum, but for the purposes of the focus schools, the data that we're looking at is for reading, viewing, and listening. Reading, viewing, and listening. So report card data, as I said earlier, is map data, and we're always continuing to find ways to extract historical report card data where we can sort of look at cohorts over time. Our report card system is locally developed and maintained, but it's created to meet our report card needs, not our data needs. So pulling data out of that electronic report card system is quite labor intensive. We don't have great access to district-wide data, a dashboard of sorts to access data at our fingertips. We don't have that. So having to pull data can be quite labor intensive. So we know that teachers use a variety of classroom data sources or street data to inform report cards. And one of the key pieces of data that supports teachers' ability to assess students' reading, of course, is our own NLPS reading assessment. Jackie's going to go into that in quite a bit more detail in just a bit, and she'll talk a little bit about what it is and how we use it and why it's such a good source of street data. So I'm going to introduce some data slides for you. And I just wanted to let you know that report cards currently, we have for our curricular subject areas a 4-point scale. And that's what you see on the screen there. The 4-point scale runs from emerging, developing, proficient to extending. And these are as per grade level expectations. So general grade level expectations in the province of British Columbia. And the data I'm going to show you overarchingly is this reading data is grade level reading data over time. Okay, so our first table. This is just a real quick snapshot, and what you're seeing here, this is NLPS, so every elementary school in our district. This is report card data for reading, viewing, and listening. Now, we've grouped together developing through to extending in each of these green bars for grades 1 to 7. And this is last year's data, end of last year's data, again, right in the middle of COVID. And this is the entire district, elementary schools. So now I'm going to jump into the focus schools data, which is what you've come to see. So this is, again, all the grade levels together. This is last year's data at the end of last year in our focus schools. Those readers who are reading anywhere between developing to extending, we haven't included emerging. So generally these children between developing and extending are reading okay. Okay, so for the focus schools, this is last year's grade 1 students. We started with grade 1 in terms of the data that we're showing you here today. So there's only one dot on the screen because they just have the 1 year in school in grade 1. We didn't include kindergarten for you today. We had started with grade 1. And there is the grade 1 reading data for last year in the focus schools. Next slide. There's grade 2 for 2021, and you see their reading data from the previous year when they were in grade 1. So this is the same cohort of students in grade 1 and then in grade 2. So they were in grade 2 last year. Okay, next, these students were in grade 3 last year, and you've got their 3 years of reading data, 2019, 2020, 21. And the blue line lets us know that there's a upward trajectory. Next is the grade 4 with their 4 years of reading results, same cohort over time. And again, you see the blue line with the trajectory. Grade 5 comes next with their 5 years of reading data. Grade 6. With 5 years of reading data. And grade 7 with their 5 years of reading data. Now, report card data is only giving us, of course, a small snapshot, but it is a snapshot. And I, again, can't help mention, especially when we're looking at this particular slide, that we are within, a global pandemic, and certainly that has impacts throughout. So I hope that I've been able to, for this time, give you a small window into the successes of the focus schools. And where I'd like to turn your attention now is to our NLPS reading assessment. So Jackie's going to take things from here, and I'll join you again to the end.
Thank you very much, Assistant Superintendent Tate. I appreciate that, and thank you for an opportunity tonight to share a bit more about the NLPS reading assessment. I'm actually going to walk through quite in detail what the assessment looks like and how it's used in schools. So this is a locally developed reading assessment that was originally created in 2014. The primary version was updated in 2020 and was renamed the Primary Assessment of Reading, or known as PARS. And the intermediate version is currently in the process of being reviewed and updated. The intent of this assessment was to be a tool created by teachers and used for teachers to be one more piece of their classroom formative assessment that looked very closely at very specific building blocks in reading and in reading comprehension. The tool is designed to help inform classroom teachers of the instructional needs of the students in their class at the start of each year. It is, of course, only one of many tools used by classroom teachers, and it focuses in on very specific aspects of a very broad language arts curriculum. The kindergarten to grade 3 PARS focuses in on the building blocks of reading, while the grade 4 to 7 looks more specifically at the components of comprehension. It's really important to understand that the larger language arts curriculum that is reported out on in our February and June report cards looks at reading, listening, and viewing, as well as writing, speaking, and representing. Here are just a couple images of what the assessment looks like at the primary level and the intermediate level. On the left, at the primary level, the assessment is done one-on-one with each child. It is done orally, and responses are recorded either on paper and then entered into a data collection system, or else they can be entered directly onto a device as the student responds orally. The PARS, which is currently for kindergarten to grade 3, again focuses on very specific building blocks of reading, such as phonemic awareness, letter sound recognition, and rhyming, just to name a few. The sample here is just one small section of a grade 2 assessment, as many of them are multiple pages. At the intermediate level, the assessment is given to the whole class at one time and currently focuses primarily on comprehension, including things like prediction, literal comprehension, making connections, and inferencing. The images on this slide are snapshots of the current grade 5 reading passage and one page of the assessment questions. As mentioned earlier, the grade 4 to 7 assessment is currently being reviewed, and we're looking at ways to make it even better to inform instruction for teachers in the future. For this to be fully beneficial for the student and the teacher, there is not really a fully standardized approach to the assessment. Teachers are encouraged to work with students throughout the assessment to garner information about their students and learn more about them and their learning. Also, any one of these assessments can actually be used at any grade level. Teachers do adjust which one they administer to best learn what they need to know about their students. Although the assessments are created by grade and are labeled by grade, it is not uncommon to have a teacher administer a different grade level assessment to dig a little bit deeper and to determine the learning needs of the student. Again, this is only one of many tools that we are using to create the picture of the child and only focuses in on some very specific aspects of the language arts curriculum. It is not the whole picture of the child and their growth and development in reading and writing. Last year, we worked hard to create our own locally developed data entry system, and it's called ESS. So this means that for our kindergarten to grade 3 teachers, they have the option of recording the information on paper and then entering it into this program, or they can actually have an iPad or a laptop or a Chromebook there with them, and they can enter the scores as the students are completing the assessment orally. At the grade 4 to 7 level, as currently the students record their answers in writing, which is then later scored by teachers, the data is entered and their responses are put in later after the assessment is done. These are just a couple of screenshots of a grade 2 one that just kind of shows you some of the assessments that are done and some of the words that we're looking at. So let me get to what does the data look like when it comes from out of ESS. Here is a sample of classroom data from a primary grade after it has been entered into the ESS program, of course with all of the names removed. This is what a teacher or a school team would be able to view after entering the information from their class. As a school, staff could also review this data as a grade to see any areas of success and areas needing focus. It's really important to note that the scores are intended to reflect where we want students to be by spring of their grade. So it is very common and even expected to see a lot of yellow and red when we do the assessment in the fall. This specific chart does reflect a fall classroom data from this year. This data is then used to look at it both horizontally and vertically. For example, as a teacher, when you have this data and can see that there is a vertical representation of yellow and red, quite common under a specific skill, it helps to guide the areas of focus for instruction for that whole class. So for example, on this chart, at a quick glance, a teacher would be able to note that complex vowels and long vowel patterns is an area of focus for the whole class instruction. In addition, a teacher or school team can look at this data horizontally and note specific students that may need additional support. Student lines that have a high proportion of yellow and in particular red scores are ones that we're taking a closer look and potentially providing some tier 2 or even tier 3 interventions may be needed. It's really important to note that a high yellow or red horizontal line may not automatically mean additional resources, but will trigger a need to do a deeper look into what is going on for that learner and how they can be best supported. The teacher always has the option throughout the year to loop back and reassess using this tool for any specific child or specific skill to see the growth that has occurred. This reassessment is often a validation of what they have seen, assessed, and observed in other ways in their classroom already. This is also a tool that we do provide out. It's another tool that teachers and schools can utilize to just review the data and take a look at making decisions for their class in regards to instruction and support. This tool can help guide the allocation of school resources, supports, and areas of focus for the classroom teacher. Not all schools use this specific tool, and many use data from other sources as well as the NLPS reading assessment. But the overall goal is always to allocate supports where there is a demonstrated need in the classroom and in the school. We certainly have shared a lot already, and as you've seen, there's a lot of this information around the data, as well as just kind of how we do collect different pieces of it. Reflecting back on the information in this presentation, Assistant Superintendent Tate showed the growth over time amongst cohorts, both as a focus school group and as a whole district. This is data pulled from our report cards that reflect the whole curriculum rather than specific skills. We're fortunate that in NLPS, on our locally developed elementary report card system, we actually report on our progress as we separate language arts out with reading, listening, and viewing, and then a separate one for writing, speaking, and representing. That's not the case in all districts. Some put their language arts report card mark just as one language arts, so we actually do have that separated out. Having that data is some solid map data that can be used by schools and as a district to see how our cohorts are progressing over time. I have gone through the NLPS reading assessment in fairly good detail, hopefully, and outlined how the formative assessment structure of this tool helps to guide a classroom teacher in their instruction. In the end, it'll be the teachers using a variety of assessment tools that guides the overall planning instruction, which in the end leads to growth over time and is reported out on the summative student reports in June.
We have some questions, and so for the sake of the principals who have joined us, if trustees want to start with questions for the focus school principals, we can maybe then let them go because they're so busy doing 8 million different things right now. We're so appreciative of everything that you folks are managing right now. Trustee Stanley, I see that you have a question about graphs. I think that's for our district level staff. Does trustees have any questions for the principals on the focus schools? Yeah, Jessica says it's for Laura. Oh, there's Trustee McKay. Go ahead.
There we go. Oh, my lighting is very terrible this evening. Sorry. Ike Squale, it's nice to see everybody. I'll start just by acknowledging the beauty in the presentations this evening. I think, you know, straight level data, as we call it now, is my favorite part. So how lucky are we to start there? I guess what my question is, actually, maybe I have one more comment because I can get away with it. Ms. Hack and Ms. Poulin, it's lovely to see you both together in one meeting at the same time. I had the great fortune of seeing both of you on a regular daily basis when you were in a school together, so it's nice to see you. My question is around, you know, at the school level, when you're thinking about the input of the data into the tool that we're using, how long do you think that takes? Does it feel like a time-consuming task? You know, I just want to get a sense of what that's like as you're going through the process of, you know, administering the assessment and then putting the data in.
So a lot of our primary have started doing their data. They're doing it as they're working with the students for the primary level, anyways. The intermediate, we're working on coming up with some ways to put our data together for that we still put it into our screener, but some of our intermediates use different reading assessments this year. So we're trying to mesh that in to make it work that they can look at it in a different way.
Oh, go ahead.
Can I speak up? Hi, Charlene. My name's Mark. I'm the vice principal over at Brecken. So I can speak up on that. No, it didn't actually take long at all. And I'll tell you why. It's because of our literacy coordinator. And so at the beginning of the year, she basically took all that assessment on. And so the classroom teacher was able to just focus on building community and building friendships and just building those relationships with the students. And I would say that as teachers, we had that parsed data in our hands by about mid-October. And then we were able to get together as grade teachers, and we're able to get together with our literacy coordinator and then start getting down to the work of like choosing materials and choosing a path for our learners. So no, it was a great assessment tool, and our literacy coordinator was the key piece that helped get it done quickly and effectively for our teachers.
I'll just echo in behind there. Sorry, Stephanie. Also having it, as Cindy did indicate, just being able to go into it where we can now enter it directly, especially that K to 3 while they're doing it, has certainly changed the timelines and how long it takes, because we're not putting it onto paper first. So for those who are comfortable to using the iPads or their Chromebook and enter it in directly, it's a much quicker process for sure.
I want to follow up, but I don't want to cut Stephanie off.
Well, that's, you know what, that's okay, because the beauty of it is that everyone does everything, like everyone does different things, right? And so at Bayview, we rally a team together and we make sure the classroom teacher's involved. So if the teacher wants to do the assessment herself, then we would provide release time. This really gives an opportunity for us to have deeper conversations instantly in terms of who may need the tier 2 or tier 3 support. And we're constantly talking and looking at it. It's really a tool that's formative that lets us know and lets the teacher know how to move next in their planning for instruction.
Great. You go ahead before I close up.
I was going to say, I teach grade 4, so I'm like right on the cusp of intermediate and primary. So I was able to do my whole class grade 3 screener in under a day, like reading to them individually. And then I followed up and did the grade 4 as well, because I wanted both the data. And that took me maybe an afternoon to administer it and maybe an hour to input it and read it and all of that. So it's really, really user friendly.
Awesome. Stephanie, you're okay if I finish? Thank you. So I have to find the right words here. First, thank you. You know, going back over the years and recognizing, you know, our intention behind this, the development of these tools, making sure that it was for that formative piece for teaching. You know, as somebody who sat and, you know, maybe didn't participate because, you know, it's more of an observation perspective, but just, it was always a question, what would that look like, you know, later on, as this gets developed, as we start using it, as we talked about, you know, do we collect data? How do we collect data? What is it used for? All of those pieces, to see it come full circle. It's taken, you know, quite a few years, but I think that just recognizes the length of time that we need to be committed to something when we embark on something new. This was new, you know, 7-8 years ago, and now it's a well-established process. So I just want to thank you for showing me what that full circle looks like, and that we're continuing on that cycle. I think it's really important, some of the feedback that you've shared today as well, just around what the board's input into focus schools, what that impact is actually in a school. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Charlene. Oh, I see Trustee Stanley with a question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the presentations. I am trying to understand, I'm having a little conflict with myself about the primary assessment process that we have kids respond orally, which on one hand makes sense for their developmental level. But my question is do we have any concerns about cultural differences in some groups being known as being more verbal and some groups being known as less verbal? And how is there a way, does that show up this early? Is there a way to address that? Like, that's kind of, you know, the little battle that I'm having with myself, is that I don't see another way to do it with this age, but I was wondering if there's concerns about differences in just simply being more orally, oral.
I'll start there and then others can jump in. As Stephanie had mentioned earlier, a lot of schools do it, you know, differently. And when it comes to that oral assessment, it actually really boils down to the relationship. So it boils down to being with somebody that they're comfortable to do that oral assessment with, finding a quiet space, maybe not doing the whole entire thing all at one time. If they're a student that just that's a little bit quieter and shyer, so you can break it down in chunks. So at that age level, a lot of the assessments we're doing, we're wanting to know their letter sound recognition. We're wanting to know whether or not they know their CVCs, or the consonant, vowel, consonant. You can only do that orally with them at that age. So it really boils down to relationships and having good connections. And, recognizing that if one teacher is not getting it, then you have somebody else come in and try, because you just want to make sure that they're comfortable. And I'll let any others jump in.
I would totally agree with you there. We having our teachers do our assessment this year was, they said the difference for them, they just felt that they had such a stronger understanding about their students, and they were working outside the classroom in a quiet area like you mentioned, and just found it was, again, we did have a couple students that we thought, okay, maybe this wasn't the best time to do it with them, so we tried and did it later on another day. We had to do that with a few students this year.
If I could just add to that really quickly, any students who require additional support, it really gives us a nice indication how we allocate our resources in terms of our ELL. And so we provide a variety of different groups for different ability and such. And so that's one way that we support students who may have cultural differences.
Thanks.
Do you have a follow-up, Trustee Stanley?
No, that's actually yes, thank you. The relationship piece was made me feel a lot more calm about it, because that is a great way not only to address shyness, but the tendencies to not be a very verbally strong person. So thank you.
Thanks. I don't see anybody else right now, so I have a question, and it's actually about the use of summative data in this cycle, because I've heard a lot about screeners, and I've heard a lot about formative data and assessments, and I'm wondering if there is, in this sort of cycle of inquiry or continuous improvement, is there a use of summative data for any purpose? I can see it, one, as for professional, like teachers in their own growth did that intervention work. But also, do you use it when I hear about, the formative assessments at the beginning of the year and getting the information in October? Like, do you use that stuff as well when you're like for classroom placements or anything like that? I just wonder if we use any summative data.
Are you referring to summative data specifically from the NLPS screener, or are you looking at?
Well, I don't think that I didn't see anything about a screener using summative data, so I guess it would be report cards. I guess it would be if teachers have developed their own, at the beginning of the year, you develop a plan based on all the wonderful tools you've just talked about. And then at the end of the year, you want to check and see if that stuff worked, right? Mm-hmm. And so how do you know if it worked? How do you know if it's working? And then also, if you do check to see if it's worked or working, do you then also use any kind of summative assessment information, whether it's report card, end of year assessment stuff, to then help with the next year? Does it follow the child, that information, does it follow the child into the next year to help as well, the next teacher who has them?
So, when we look, and again, I think we're all going to be able to have slightly different answers as we approach it, but we always take a look at that information when we look at class placements. So when we come to June and we're looking at some of the summative, comments that teachers have, and they're looking at class placements, we'll often use cards that kind of, we'll let students know where they're at. So we make sure we have a range of skill sets and a range of strengths coming into our classes the following year. I know that I can speak for myself personally. Always would encourage, teachers to have conversation with last year's teacher in regards to what was the growth that those students showed. Go back and look at last year's report card and have a chance to read the comments as well as take a look at the growth that they've had. So it's the conversations, the collaboration. That was often a conversation that would happen at our PLCs that has not been able to happen as much, of course, but we certainly encourage that amongst that conversation, that dialogue.
Okay.
Hey, Stephanie, I'll actually pipe up and I'll talk as a classroom teacher. Yeah, I would reiterate what Jackie was saying. It's kind of like as a teacher, when you receive these students come into your classroom in September and they're coming from maybe your neighbor, like beside you in the school. Yeah, you do both, right? You go through their files and you look through their report cards and you read what the previous teachers wrote about them. Certainly, if you have a student coming in from another district or maybe from another school, first thing you're going to do is go through that file and then read their report card comments and then look at that. But then you're going to follow it up with conversations, right? You're going to go over and visit the teacher beside you and ask what worked with them or what didn't work with them, or where were they, or you know, do you have any suggestions for me about materials that might be suitable for that student or what might capture their interest? And so it's really a blended process of looking at that summative assessment, but then also those conversations about the child as a whole, and then that determines your vision and like your pathway for them, if you will, as the teacher. So.
Thanks. And can I just ask for principals, like, does this also come into play in terms of the school planning process, looking at, you know, this, I've heard you talk a lot about, you know, group planning and co-planning and things like that. And so I'm assuming that plans are set out for the year, and then at some point, you know, at the end of the year, is there a check-in using that type of sort of looking at what happened with the report cards, checking back to see if the plan worked, if the interventions were working? Is that part of the school-based process as well?
Definitely. And I'd also say that for our school, I know like we have a literacy goal for the whole school. And some of our professional development days are spent on our goals of what we feel that are really our areas that we want to work on with our students.
I'm actually just going to jump in as well and just say it's actually not necessarily waiting till the end of the year. So often with our schools, we're taking a look every 6 weeks, every 8 weeks with some of the interventions that are happening. Do we need to shift the supports? Do we need to look at it going differently? So we don't wait until the end. We're doing that just ongoing. And here I am still talking like I'm we in a school. You know, so that's a piece that's just an ongoing piece that you continue to take a look at. And then of course in June, take a look back and say, did some of the shifts and changes we made throughout the year make a difference for students?
Stephanie, I'm gonna ask, so you kind of were talking about, you know, when we organize the students, I think, like you're wondering if we look at that summative data and that informs us how we organize the kids into classes and things like that. It actually plays a small piece in that. And so for us over at Brecken, like the needs and the backgrounds of the students are so complex that we don't really look at that summative piece too much. We really look at the relationships that already exist between the students. And so when we think about building up classes, we're actually looking at the relationships inside there. We expect that when we go in later and then go and do that data poll and then look at the abilities of the students, we're actually going to find like it's just so complex. It's not like you have a strong class over here and a medium class over here. It just doesn't work like that. So we actually really look at the personalities and the relationships of the students and what's going to be the learning environment that's most optimum for those students, and then build that. And then the summative stuff, though, is for us at Brecken, not the most important. So, but it is important, but it's not, it doesn't play a big giant role. We're really looking at the holistic student. So.
Thanks. I saw one more hand.
I think that was me. I was just going to say that, like, I do the screener over and over through the year to set a new goal, because it's kind of like, okay, we've set a goal, then I see if we're there, we set a new goal. So for me, I think summative data is not really ever happening because it's just formative for the next year. So I just see it going as a continual growth of their reading or their ability through their whole education. So if we can just keep moving them forward and re-changing the goal, because we want them to keep going, right? So that was kind of my thought on summative data. Like, we kind of go, okay, this is where they are at the end of the year, but that's informing us for next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, okay. I don't think I see any more questions for our school-based staff who are, I know everybody's really busy, but Jackie and Laura, I think there's some more questions for you. I will say on behalf of everyone, thank you for coming tonight. I've really found this really interesting and informative, and I always really appreciate hearing what everyone's doing and just knowing that how hard everyone's working in the context that we're currently in as well. I just want to extend a lot of gratitude on behalf of the board for everything everyone's doing. Thank you for coming tonight and taking the time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
You're welcome to hang out if you want, but you don't have to. So I'm going to go back to the questions that I think Trustee Stanley was next, and she said she had a question for Laura on graphs.
I do, but I'm going to skip it to go to other questions because of time, and if we have time, we'll come back to it. I didn't understand the graphs. So, and you know, I'm a stats person, so I'll save that because I really have some other bigger questions that I think are more, you know, trustee role questions. So I'm going to start with the big one, right? Like, and it's kind of, I'm going to give you my follow-up, or at least what I expect my follow-up to be with my question, and it's kind of more of an explanation of my question, which is, the question is, you know, what do we use, what criteria, how do we determine what becomes a focus school or what makes a focus school? And I asked this because I was going to ask this question going in because I see some schools that are not thriving, and I wonder why they're not focus schools. And so I don't understand what the criteria is. And then when I looked at the list that you presented in the various versions of schools, I was really surprised by version 2.0 because I thought, wow, the school that I'm specifically thinking of, I was, you know, I was shocked that some schools were in there and it wasn't type scenario. So I'm really trying to understand, you know, how do we determine what, you know, how we identify a school that gets additional resources in becoming a focus school?
So if Jackie, I'm not sure if it's helpful to put that particular slide back up, but when we look at each of those categories, for lack of a better way to describe it, I've been sitting here trying to think of a different way to, and a different word to use, but essentially on each of those continua, we rank the schools from most vulnerable to least vulnerable numerically. So we converted things like report card marks, the EDI, the vulnerability index. Vulnerability index gives you regions in BC that are, it literally ranks the vulnerability for you. And so we're looking at the vulnerability of the schools. And in addition to that, we looked at schools. We literally looked at the Indigenous student population. Did they have a high or low Indigenous student population? Do they have a significant on-reserve? Like you think about Seaview, for example, has a significant on-reserve population. And so we took all of those things into account. Some of it was objective, and some of it, like the Indigenous students and the on-reserve populations, was a little more subjective. So we literally ranked the schools from most to least vulnerable and had an order. And then we went back in and layered over again and looked at, okay, now of those schools, you know, which ones have Indigenous population, significant Indigenous population, serve an on-reserve population, etc. It was lots of tables and numbers and flipping from top to bottom and bottom to top process.
Do you have more follow-up, Jessica, to your?
No, I don't, because that was the question. So thank you.
I don't see anyone else in the chat box yet. So I had a question, and it's sort of along the same lines, and it's, you know, how are we monitoring the, you know, the focus schools for success and improvement, but then also to Trustee Stanley's point, you know, Laura, I heard you say, you know, we've asked people to volunteer. We asked them to put up their hands because we want them to have buy-in. But what about schools that aren't putting up their hands? So what are we doing to, one, monitor the focus schools for success and improvement? Do we know, and I guess this is from that trustee sitting at the boardroom table, figuring out where there's emerging area of needs, and this whole cycle that we're in now in terms of our strategic plan. So, how are we monitoring them and know that this is working? What are we doing? And I think you've touched a little bit on that, and the presentation showed it a little bit, but really I'm kind of looking at the district level, what you're doing to monitor that. And then also, what do we do to monitor other schools that might not be focus schools that might need to be? I think about the notion of appreciative inquiry, where we say, let's look at all the good things we're doing, but then the things that we're doing that aren't really good kind of get missed because we're focusing on. So I just wonder how we also then would figure out if a school might need to become a focus school.
Okay, that's a lot of questions. So I think where I'm gonna start is the monitoring focus schools for success. Humbly, I will say that is the presentation, that it is that, and I don't want to play the importance of anecdotal data that we meet regularly, that we talk through. We require principals to bring their data when we have these meetings, and we expect them. I'd be able to pick any student in that data set, and have the principal be able to speak to that student and their reading and their success. This is the report. The presentation today gave you a really small snapshot, but we work closely together and we meet regularly. With COVID, it's been a little bit different, but over the 7 years, it is intensive. We meet and there's expectations, there's homework between every meeting that they need to go back, and everything from how do we align, how do we build common beliefs and values around the teacher reading in our schools, to I need to be able to articulate when I go to this meeting every single Indigenous student's reading success. And so I really can't, I can't emphasize more how important that those qualitative aspects of this are. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I don't have at my fingertips district-wide data. I can't turn on my computer with a dashboard and click on, female Indigenous students reading in grade 9. I can't do that. What we're trying to do is, well, you've seen beautiful examples. Jackie and the principals talked to the beautiful examples of the data we do have access to at the district level. Currently, the report card data is one of the sources that we have that every teacher needs to participate in, that we have an electronic system that IS can work with our learning coordinators to dig in and find us some pieces. So in terms of other schools, the first graph you saw, it was report card data for all of the schools. Again, I don't want to, or I do want to emphasize again the anecdotal and observational value that principals and teachers in schools have, and those conversations that learning services has with those schools pointedly. And if we look at so many of the structures and systems in our district, things like school plans, school growth plans, professional growth plans from principals that are connected to growth plans. We look at all the professional learning opportunities. We look at if we look at even our learning coordinator team or some of the district resources that we provide, that they are boots on the ground and they are responsive to teachers' needs in the moment, at the time, all the time. And so when they provide one-on-one, small group, large group, whole district support around a myriad of topics, it's because there's been a need that has been expressed. Do I think we could benefit a little bit more from having a little bit more easy access to district-wide data? Absolutely. We don't have it at the moment, but we've made our way through in a variety of alternate ways at the moment. Not remembering your entire question.
That's because I didn't ask it very well. It was like not super clear. I think I tried to
answered it very well.
Too many in. I think you did. I don't know, Jackie, if you had anything you wanted to add. You looked like you did at one point, so I don't want to cut you off.
No, I think actually Laura summed it up quite well.
Okay, I appreciate the information on. And I can appreciate hearing from you how difficult it is to kind of summarize this in this way that might make someone who sits really far away from this and is, much farther than arm's length in this oversight role to try to sum up what it is that we might need in order to do our jobs here. But I really learned a lot tonight about the focus schools, and it's been nice to sort of remind ourselves what they are. And I'm also very surprised at the amount that you're, not that I'm not surprised at the amount that you're doing, I'm surprised at the amount you're doing with the number of minutes there are in a day.
Right.
And so I really do appreciate it. And at some point when there's more minutes in the day, it might be good for us to just get a little, like, the presentation, maybe even just giving us the presentation, because it answered a lot more of the questions that I had from the agenda package even.
Right.
But just learning more about it. But I do think, to Trustee Stanley's point, I'm still a little curious about how we have determined, and I think, you know, basically what you've told me is that there's a whole bunch of data out there, and these, is it 5 schools now? Sorry. 6 schools.
Well,
6
it's 5.
schools.
I mean, NK is part of Bayview, so we include them as well. So that it feels like 6.
Oh yeah, there they are. Okay.
And
so,
the North Oyster, sorry, North Oyster is the English side only.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. That these are the ones that just have the most need based on this, you know, large graph board that you may have. And can I ask if enhancement agreements or BCT play a role in any of that as well?
I'm going to say, I don't believe directly they do. I do think, however, when we look at the key, like, I do want to emphasize that Bayview, Fairview, Brechin, and Bayview, Georgia, are the 4 schools from the beginning, and we've run the criteria that you look at only 2 or 3 times. We don't run it every year. But when we do run it, and we have to list the schools from most vulnerable to least, those 4 schools don't sit as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They sit as 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the 5th school is about number 20. Like, there's a huge gap between those 4 and the remaining 22.
Can you say that again? I think.
Yep. So if we were, I hate saying the word ranking, but when we figured out the scores, some of them were inverted, and we had to add them all up. We had to do a whole bunch of arithmetic to get these all the schools ranked on a continuum for each of those measurements. So report card marks. We did 2 separate versions of report card marks. One that for kids, we included one where the kids weren't on the scale at all, and then another one where we included just the kids that are on the scale. So when we ranked, added, you know, looked at all of those, ranked all the schools on each of those, blended them, got an average, then we put them in order of most vulnerable to least vulnerable. Like, we blended all those together, so there was one number for each school, and the school with the highest vulnerability score went at the top, the least at the bottom. The gap between the 4 original focus schools is quite large. So let's say they had an average score was 75, right? And the bottom, their vulnerability score was 2. The gap between the 4 first schools was, you know, was quite large compared to the rest of the schools where they were 1 or 2 numbers apart.
Okay.
Does
Now
that make
I get
sense?
what you meant. Yes.
Yeah.
There was one little thing in there that I got a little lost at. Okay. Thanks. Oh, I see Trustee McKay has a follow-up to the BCT question.
I didn't answer it, that's why. I got sidetracked.
That's good. Thanks, Stephanie. Laura, that's too funny. I like it. I'm just thinking, you know, when I think about BCT and I think about, you know, what does that look like at the district level? I guess my follow-up question really might be more for Scott or for Ricky, because wouldn't our LEAs cover a lot of that, or maybe be the connection to what we're talking about between focus schools and supports for Indigenous kids? I'm just wondering if there's an overlap there that maybe we could speak to. Maybe it comes out of those documents as opposed to the provincial BCT.
Yeah, if I could, through you, Chair. Thanks for the question. I don't know if I can answer that question specifically, but generally, I may be touching on Trustee Stanley's question, is that, and I think Laura said it as well, we're only looking at this data every few years. I happen to know that the EDI data in a place like Cedar Gabriola, the kindergarten students that went in there in 2019 are extremely vulnerable. on that EDI data. Some of the most vulnerable in the province, in fact. They had a huge jump from the last wave of EDI data. And so maybe Trustee Stanley is speaking to that issue. And sorry, I just took the opportunity because you mentioned my name. I can't really speak to the question you're asking about LEA, but I don't know if Ricky's here this evening, but maybe she could do a better job of that. But it is complicated using all of this data, and I really appreciate how Laura was talking about ranking all of those. It's a terrible thing to say, of course, but how we rank those schools to provide just really a little more resource per school. It's not a whole lot, as you saw on the PowerPoint. So I'll just take the opportunity to thank Laura and Jackie right now for the presentation, and really fabulous presentations by the principals and vice principals. And Stephanie, you had what I considered for a moment there, just a conversation about education, and vice principals were jumping in and you didn't ask. It was awesome. So there's my excitement for the evening. Thank you.
I kept seeing Ricky pop on and off. Ricky, do you have something you want to add?
Good evening, everyone. I too am unable to answer the question tonight, but I will definitely maybe have that prepared for March when I'm going to talk to you about some Indigenous grad rates and data with Dawn.
Thank you. Awesome. Thanks, Ricky.
Yeah, I'll look for sure.
So I guess, and this maybe is a Scott, if you want to stay on, or Laura, to the point that you just talked about, and I don't think we should be scared of using the word ranking when we're doing it for good things. Like, we're talking about figuring out where we need to resource schools. That's good stuff. So let's not be scared of a word because some other Voldemort type association has made the word dirty. It has use, I think, at times. And so when we're doing it for where we should be applying resources, I think that the way in which you're using it in the context, it makes sense. And so I guess I wonder then, if it's every few years, how do we know? And I look at that list of oh boy, I might have jumped in. I just saw that this went on the speaker. So I'm sorry if I jumped in front of someone. I just saw the little question come up. So I'll just keep going, and then we'll move on to the speakers list, which is how do we, I saw that, the 1.0, the 2.0, the 3.0 versions of focus schools. What was it that made us change from 1 to 2 to 3? And then how do we then, if we're only doing it every few years, how do we know we're not, like when you talk about these most vulnerable kindies, Scott, like a couple of years makes a big difference in their life, right? So how do we know that we're staying focused, we're focusing the focus schools in the areas that focus that they need to be?
I want to just remind all of us that the focus schools supports do not equal no supports elsewhere. The focus school supports do not equal we see Gabriella or Cedar with some challenges and we don't address them. So we operate in the same way with all of our schools, depending on what the issues are, depending on what we see, and then we shift resources, or we support, or we come together and help that principal plan for those kindergarten students in a very meaningful, tactful, important way. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. Sorry, Scott, I'm not sure if you were going to respond and I jumped in there.
Okay. Thanks, Laura. I appreciate that. There's a question from Trustee Stanley.
Question. I have like 3 that I have to choose from. This feels like a really much needed conversation, doesn't it? So thank you. It's been good. At the risk of maybe trying to get another one after this, I'm gonna choose this question. I think, Jackie, when you went through the whatever that stoplight version slide that you had of red, green, yellow, and you explained both the vertical and the horizontal analysis, that was really appreciated because it helped me understand how teachers can use the data both at a class level. So, you know, what can they do at a class level versus, you know, hey, this student has these needs. Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I'm wanting to know kind of, and that was a question of mine coming in, but I'm not fully resolved. And it's kind of like that in that vein of, you know, how is it that once we've done these assessment, we have this information, then how do we, you know, once we have someone who is someone or something, like maybe it's not an individual, but it's demonstrated need, class, a school, a person, like, how is it that we then take this information and go back and address, you know, to help to address that demonstrated need? And how do we know that this is happening? So we've had some really great, you know, staff members explain it, how they do it personally, but how do we know that this is like an embedded process across the system?
I'll jump in and start, Laura, and then you can, how do we address it? You know, in a school, that's where you have those conversations, right? So as a classroom teacher, and there's a specific, I'm going to speak to, you know, some of the vertical where it's a skill set, then that's where that teacher knows they're going to focus in some of their instruction. They may look at to their IST teacher in regards to some things that they could be doing extra things in their classroom. They might reach out to a learning coordinator and say, you know, this is an area that I really need to focus in on, and you know, what are some other strategies that I can use? And same thing with the horizontal. That's where you can again come back as a school and take a look and say, okay, which of our students, you know, have the needs? Where do we have to dig a little bit deeper? What are the needs? How are we organizing some of our supports in regards to the interventions that we're providing to them? So it's around having those conversations, having the dialogue, and reaching out to literacy coordinators in another school. Just because they're at the focus schools doesn't mean that we don't make sure we can't reach out to them and ask questions and get resources, the learning coordinators, and providing different strategies that go with it.
Through the chair to Trustee Stanley, the second question that you had, was that sort of an accountability question? How do we ensure that it's happening everywhere?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll invite Jackie to jump in as well. But principals have access to all that data, so they'll know if a class is right. So we have a second electronic software program called ESS, where the information is housed, the data is housed, and principals can see whose data is in there and whose isn't. So they'll support classrooms to, as the principals talked about, they will work together and ensure that the data is complete for all students. And I will say that I'm going to go out on a limb here by saying this a little bit, but I believe at the bottom of my heart and my brainstem that philosophically and pedagogically, the leadership that is out there in our schools believes in this, and they want to support this. And I've seen the data been utilized during PLC times in such beautiful ways in these conversations to support learning, to support one another as colleagues. So that is really helpful, and it makes all of this, your quasi-accountability question, a lot easier.
Thank you.
Still don't see anyone else, so I'm going to ask another question because, like Scott said, we're talking about learning and it's making me excited. But I can't help but be a little bit political with my question. I'm just going to acknowledge that at the beginning. But so when I listened to the presentation, you talked a lot about sort of the struggle at getting district level data from assessments and from report cards for all sorts of reasons. The design of the assessment, the software that houses the report cards. And that left me wondering does that mean that one of the only sources of data that we have at the district level that's fulsome in terms of all students is the FSAs?
Could I just jump in first, Laura, and then we'll go from there? I do think that, you know, in the last year and a half, we have been working towards getting that report card data easier to pull out. It's still some labor intensive, but we've been working with IT to be able to pull some historical data around the report cards. And so that's where we're going to pull it up and pull the line graphs up and provide some of that. So I do think we still have work to do on it. And it still isn't, you know, as easy as turning on a computer and hitting a button, but it's certainly something that we have more of when it comes to the elementary summative report card data.
I saw Dawn. Hi, Dawn.
Good evening, everyone. I've been so enjoying the presentations and listening to the student stories and really enjoying the conversation. And I can't help but note, it gives me great joy that we're talking about learning. And it also gives me great joy to see trustees engaging in a red, green, yellow classroom kind of sample and getting excited about the vertical conversations that will be happening and the horizontal conversations and the year over year. So I'm super excited about that. And I'll just add for what Jackie and Laura were hinting at around the data. We're moving towards a model with a product called Power BI, which creates a dashboard which allows some of our data from the ministry and some of our local data to kind of play nice with each other, so that when we ask what seems like a simple question, like, you know, can we look at the FSA results for a student who has been also a child in care, who's also you know, moved to 3 different schools, which is a great question to ask. Right now, it would take one of our data analysts, you know, a week and a half to get us some answers on that. Power BI will get us to a point where we can pull all that information and kind of represent it visually and share that out with our school leaders and say, hey, did you know that if this is a child who's not yet meeting expectations in FSAs and has also been a child in care at any time and is at 3 different schools, this is what the data tells us. So we're moving towards that. Right now, I think the challenge is we just have to ask really good questions, because when we go investing a lot of time in digging into the data, we want to make sure that we're spending time to get the right answers for the energy in. But we're definitely going there. I'm just happy to join the data conversation. I have my camera off for so long.
Thanks. I actually think that vertical horizontal class, I think about it because, you know, we think things in the district level. I think about what that would look like actually at the district level, like to have something like that, when you're able to have the data that's necessary and that you can access it. That sounds like it's being worked on, and so I'm excited for those conversations as well. Jessica, Trustee Stanley has one more question, and then I promise. I think I'll just cap it to myself. I'll zip it.
I don't know. Dawn just talked about a whole new data thing. Like, we can be here till midnight now. I'm kidding. Kinda. So here's me being political, ish, kind of, 2 things, and rhetorical. And I guess I'm somewhat aiming this. I mean, it kind of seems like Scott, but I also think that, hey, trustees, can we think about this? And Mark. So, you know, the data is telling us here that when we have additional resources and supports, they are, quote, paramount for success. We've had significant surpluses in the past years. And I think that we need to wonder why we aren't, or maybe we should, or what that would look like, putting more resources into more schools. So that's semi-rhetorical. I don't know if Scott wants to tell me why that's not a good idea. But I do think that's a question that needs to be considered, considering the obvious impact. Mark comes on. Yes, the obvious impact that we're learning about these focus schools.
I was going to say, you go ahead, Mark.
Okay, well, just it might be useful, just as a, through you, Chair, just as a reminder that, you know, we do talk about, you know, as we get more students and the funding that comes with them, resources flow to support them, and it's not just classroom teachers. And so, you know, we have meetings all the time to discuss specific needs at specific schools, to outlay additional supports this year. Additional ELL flowed to support needs. additional EAs flowed to support needs, and of course those are additional kids as well. Learning supports for schools. So it is a bit of an iterative process in that it all doesn't happen at budget time. Of course, we're not aiming to have very large surpluses, but so I guess I would say that there is a lot of additional supports that have flowed to schools. I'm sure Laura could probably talk off the back of her hand and Dawn about exactly where and when and how and where they went, but they definitely is additional added throughout the year as we see the funds attached to kids flow. So don't want to suggest that it's, you know, at budget time and then it stops. It is a constant flow out, and a lot of it to schools. In the September time when we have those very large chunks, that's slightly different, pretty rare, you know, COVID related, conservative international student estimates, etc. Had created those opportunities for the board to focus on some big things, but as we do get funds, we do get kids, those funds flow on a regular basis, not just to classroom teachers, but also to additional supports for those kids.
Someone else have anyone? No. I would also add, I think, to what Mark is saying, that I think having some of those reserves, which is different than surplus, but we use surplus to have reserves, that allows us, if I'm hearing what Mark said and also what you said earlier, Laura, is that we do respond to need, and we do it because we have some money set aside, or having the reserves, the surpluses that become reserves because we didn't allocate them all the year before during budget time, to say, okay, this has popped up, this group of kids is vulnerable, or this area needs, you know, extra supports in this particular way, where we can fill them with bodies, because we also know that that's quite difficult these days in our sector as well. But so it does sound to me like partly what you're saying, what the Secretary Treasurer is saying, and what you said earlier, Laura, is that we do respond, and if we don't allocate everything out during budget time, then that allows us to be responsive to emerging needs throughout the year as well. Okay. And I see Trustee McKay and then Trustee Bailey.
Thank you. To figure out how to say my words, you think I'd be prepared by the time it's time to turn on my microphone, but I never am. Dawn, thank you for sharing that piece about the dashboard. You know, I know that we use something similar for looking at Indigenous student success, and that has been very fruitful, I would say, in the last couple of years. And so I would expect that a future dashboard that's maybe a little more widespread would be just as successful. When I start thinking about pulling local data into ministry level data and report cards and all of those different types of things, it does make me pause for a moment. And I just share this with the entire board to say that when I think about screener data and the formative pieces that we've talked a lot about tonight, I don't see a place for that data within that district level data collection. You know, back in the day, because I'm old apparently, there was some really significant commitments, promises, which I don't make easily, and that was a commitment that I made, was that data would never be intended for district level use or collections for a summative purpose. And so that's something that I would need to hold true to, unless I heard from all of the parties involved back at that time to say, yes, we're prepared to move this data into a different space and time. So I guess I just offer that historical caution of, you know, there was a really big commitment then, and I don't want to see us go down that road until those thoughtful relational conversations have been had before it becomes, I don't know, a bigger, as it was said earlier, a political piece. So that's, I don't know, I'm adding that in there because it's just one more layer of all of the different levels of things that we're saying today. But those commitments back then, they made for meaningful conversations in order for the screeners to be developed. So I just, we'd have to return to those conversations before we did anything with that, in my opinion. Thanks.
Thanks, Trustee McKay. And I think what we did here tonight as well is that data isn't really appropriate for that type of use, but that there's probably a lot of other data that we can utilize, i.e. report card data, for for district level data and having access to a lot more of it only works to help us do better at our continuous cycle of improvement, right? One of our goals, continuous improvement. I see Trustee Bailey has a question. Yay, Trustee Bailey's first question in Education Committee.
Yay. Yeah, my question is, I'm just curious about the supports in the focus schools, and I was wanting to know if those supports follow through to high school, to the the catchment schools that end up going to a certain high school. Does that level of support follow the student into the high school system?
I don't know if Dawn, you would like to jump in on that one, but if we look at our secondary schools, very similar to our elementary schools, there's a certain degree of, staffing resources being allocated as per, say, pupil FTE, etc. But then layered over top of that comes individualized need, and then the schools are resourced based on that context. But Trustee Bailey, we don't have a direct link to the focus schools at the secondary level, but it is something we have toyed with. We've tried different pilots for reading intervention, and this is reading intervention in terms of like decoding, like kind of primary, those skills that you normally have in primary, at a couple of our secondary schools. And it certainly is an area that Learning Services is super interested in. So it was a great question. Dawn, I'm not sure if you want to add to that.
I'll just add on that I think one of the advantages of having the extra energy and resources in those focus schools is to try to provide some equity for those students who, you think of that EDI indicator. One of our responses as a district is to put resources into that child when they're in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, as they go through the school. And I think the emphasis at the secondary level is doing an effective job of providing transition support. So what are the additional supports those students need coming from a focus school as they go into their secondary school? And we're doing some work on transition programming that Jackie and her coordinators are leading around that.
That's a really good point, that up until this year, focus schools were very concentrated in K to 3. So even in a K to 7 school, it was the K to 3 children reading, like we really narrowed the focus so we could have as much impact as possible. And it definitely was an early intervention project.
Do you have a follow-up, Trustee Bailey? You're still muted.
Hey.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And we know from the Finnish school system, which has been very successful, they do the majority of their interventions in the K to 3 level. So yeah, that makes sense. I just know, coming from having taught elementary and high school, sometimes I think there's a lot of support for the students in the K to 7 system. Some of that has to do with how the school is designed. Students are with the same classroom teacher. But when they get up to high school, it's where you also see the gap widen again. So, my concern is it would be really neat if we could see those supports happening, at the high school level as well. Excuse me, I have a bad cold.
Scott, it looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah, maybe just reiterating a little bit, but if you had an extra $1, we would put 90 cents into early intervention, which is sort of the philosophy that started the focus schools. But Dawn, maybe you want to talk just a little bit about things like outreach or counseling support at secondary, where we've had a little bit more.
Absolutely, and when trustees were talking about reserves and having the ability to be reactive, I think through the pandemic we've been able to look at what are some predictable needs in the system, and then there's been a lot of unpredictable needs. And the last couple of years, some of those unpredictable needs have been, at the secondary level, have been students who disengaged from their schooling. And being able to respond as a system and say we have some additional staffing for outreach to address the needs of those students who in grade 8 or 9 simply were not attending last year. And so we kind of invested some energy into reconnecting those students and putting different supports in place. And we've done the same this year as well. And I think going forward, there's a need. And we're starting to talk now at secondary schools about graduation program readiness, which is that transition from grade 9 to grade 10. So going from the competency-based K-9 program into the graduation program where they start earning credits. And so those are little intervention points. So when Laura talks about, early intervention, the K-3, at secondary, we talk about the interventions at the transition into grade 8, but also that transition into the graduation program. So there are needs and there are resources that schools they're orienting their resources differently to be more responsive to kids who are too, our kids in going into grade 10 next year will be in their 3rd year of a pandemic, right? And not all of them have had a real positive world experience. So there's a definite need there for sure.
Thanks, Don. I don't see any more questions. We have had an almost 2-hour conversation, and we did not talk about health and safety. And we only said COVID in the context of particular conversations. So well done, everyone. Yay for us. And even more yay for our senior team and their ability to have these learning focused conversations despite the insane hamster wheel that we all currently find ourselves on. So thank you for the information tonight and being able to stay focused and keeping us informed so that we can continue to do our job. I really appreciate it. We have, seeing no further questions, and I'm just going to keep moving through. We have no correspondence tonight from the regular board. We have no unfinished business. We have no new business. I don't believe we have any questions. No questions. So if I could get someone to move adjournment. Jessica moves to adjourn. Can I get a seconder for that? Seconded by, oops, I've got, well, look at everybody. I've got Chantel. Let's say Chantel, Trustee O'Neill is seconding adjournment. And if there's no objections to adjourning, then we are done. Thank you, everyone.